Good morning. Welcome to today's board meeting. We have one item on our agenda today, a potential agenda decision for our board related to digital assets and classification of stablecoins and similar assets. So with that, let me turn it over to our team and Jacob to lead our discussion this morning. Good morning, Jacob.
Good morning, and thank you, Rich. As you say, the purpose of today's meeting is for the board to discuss recent stakeholder feedback received on the accounting for digital assets, and for the board to consider whether to add a project to the technical agenda on whether certain stable coins and other similar assets may be considered as cash equivalents. Specific details can be found in the board meeting handout. Before we talk about stable coins, I would like to provide an overview of the current research project on digital assets. In January 2025, the staff issued the agenda consultation invitation to comment, which I will refer to as the 2025 ITC, for public comment to solicit broad stakeholder feedback on the future FASB standard setting agenda. The feedback received on the 2025 ITC was summarized at the October 8th, 2025 board meeting. Due in part to the feedback that had been received, including recommendations released in the report issued by the President's Working Group on Digital Asset Markets, Rich added a project on digital assets to the research agenda on August 13th, 2025. The research project is exploring targeted improvements to the accounting for and disclosure of certain digital assets and related transactions, including whether certain payment digital assets are cash equivalents, and the accounting for certain digital asset transfers, such as crypto lending. Many stakeholders provided feedback on the accounting for digital assets in response to the 2025 ITC and through an agenda request received recently, relating to the scope criteria for crypto assets in topic 350-60, the classification of stablecoins, accounting for crypto asset transfers and derecognition, gross versus net presentation, and the impacts of tokenized ownership of real-world assets, among other topics. While today's discussion is on the classification of stablecoins, we are continuing to research the other digital asset-related issues, and we'll bring those back for the board's consideration at a future board meeting. Before we discuss the agenda prioritization criteria for adding a project related to the classification of stablecoins to the board's technical agenda, I will provide a summary of the stakeholder feedback we have heard related to the classification of stablecoins. As part of the 2025 ITC, stakeholders provided mixed views on whether the board should change the definition of cash equivalents. However, almost all stakeholders that identified this topic as a high priority suggested that the board consider classification of stablecoins. The cash equivalent classification is elective under current GAAP. However, depending on the terms, conditions, and rights conveyed through the arrangement, some stakeholders responded that a lack of authoritative and consistent accounting guidance has led to uncertainty in stablecoin accounting classification, whether as cash equivalents, financial assets, or general or distinct intangible assets. None of the 2025 ITC respondents that deprioritized revisions to the cash equivalence definition specifically referred to stablecoins or other digital assets as the basis for their views. Instead, the rationale among those respondents primarily cited their concerns of unintended consequences, their perceptions that the current definition is sufficiently understood in practice, and their views that revising and revisiting the definition of cash equivalents is a relatively low priority compared with other accounting issues. The staff also conducted outreach as part of its pre-agenda research with practitioners, preparers, and others, and requested feedback from investors. None expressed that they would be opposed to a project to clarify whether certain stablecoins may be classified as cash equivalents. With that background on stakeholder feedback, to add a project to the technical agenda, a potential project needs to meet the board's 3 agenda prioritization criteria. The first criterion is whether there is a pervasive need to improve the accounting. The use of stablecoins has increased in recent years. The use is also forecasted to grow, and many stakeholders expressed that there was a shared acknowledgement that USD-pegged stablecoins are growing in importance in financial markets and global payments. Many stakeholders who supported a project expressed a preference for revisions to the master glossary definition of cash equivalents to clarify whether certain stablecoins and other similar assets may qualify as cash equivalents. The second criterion is whether there are feasible solutions that justify the costs. We have identified technically feasible solutions, and those potential solutions are included in question 2 of the handout. These include A, revise the cash equivalence definition in the master glossary, B, add a new digital cash equivalence definition to the master glossary. And C, add examples to illustrate whether certain types of stablecoins and other digital assets would or would not qualify as cash equivalents under the current cash equivalent definition. The third criterion is whether the project has an identifiable scope. While respondents expressed differing views on whether the definition of cash equivalents should be broadened, many agreed that certain stablecoins that meet specific criteria should qualify. Various stablecoins have different characteristics. Some stablecoins are backed by reserve assets while others are not. Additionally, some stablecoins permit holders to redeem to cash directly from the stablecoin issuer, while others either do not or place restrictions on such redemptions. Many stakeholders noted that if the board were to pursue such a project, it should only be for stablecoins that are highly liquid, readily convertible to known amounts of fiat currency, and fully collateralized by cash, short-term U.S. treasuries, or other assets that currently meet the master glossary definitions of the term cash or cash equivalents. With that background, I'll now hand it back to the board to discuss questions 1 and 2 on whether the board would like to add a project to its technical agenda, and if so, what directional feedback relating to the objectives or scope of the project or other input the board would like to share with us relating to the staff's outreach and research.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. And maybe before we go around to the board, just an observation. The term stablecoin isn't defined. And I think very often what we're going to be talking about is attributes of a digital asset. So I mentioned that I do get a little concerned that if we poll 5 people and bring up stablecoin, they may have 5 different definitions of what that is. So I think part of this discussion and if we do decide to add some of the direction to the staff is defining exactly what attributes we would be talking about. If we are going to, for example, provide examples of the application of the current cash and cash equivalence guidance. So I do just want to emphasize that as much for our audience as anyone else. Okay. Yes, Christine.
So I had a question, I think, related to that point, because in the description of the project or in the question about adding a project, it says stablecoins and other similar assets. I wondered what an example of an other similar asset would be.
Yeah, I think that to Rich's point, it was because the term stablecoin was not necessarily defined and we were thinking about characteristics of certain assets that may qualify. We thought about if there are those characteristics might encompass other types of assets, and things that came to mind might include tokenized deposits that certain banks issue or tokenized money market funds, for example, things of that nature that may or may not meet the qualifications depending on what they end up being, but could have similar characteristics to some types of stablecoins.
Okay, that's very helpful. So then the other question I had, would CBDC or central bank digital currencies be included or not?
I think that'd be something we'd have to research a little bit as part of the secondary steps, perhaps, of a potential project. I'm not sure yet what they would or would not.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
I would certainly suggest you weigh in on if you think fiat currencies should or shouldn't be, since they're likely already addressed. But Marcia?
Yeah, I just had a follow-up question to your answer to be clear. When we were talking about similar assets, are you talking about digital assets only?
That could be one of the scopes that the board might direct us to pursue. I think there also could be other assets that don't have to be digital, that if they meet these certain criteria that we may incorporate either through an example or through a revision to a definition, that also could qualify or could be clarified as to how current practice is applying, for example, existing money market funds, perhaps. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? All right, so questions 1 and 2. And I'll have everyone address 1 and 2, just in case we get to 4. That way we don't have to go back around.
So I would like to add a project to the agenda. I think that we've received enough feedback that would suggest that there's a need for some clarity in GAAP and in the codification around whether a stable coin or a digital asset is a cash equivalent. I think, we've gotten feedback from our outreach. We've gotten recommendations from the presidential working group. I think that it's sufficient to say that there's some question in practice and that, we should address it. So I would support adding something to the agenda. I think the objective that I would probably be aiming for would be something more along the lines of a clarification. And so maybe not to give away where I'm thinking about scope, but I think we heard from some of the outreach participants that the current definition of cash and cash equivalents is sufficient to be able to determine, whether this is in scope or not in scope or out of scope. And so I think that they also highlighted that there were some potential inherent consequences that could occur to the extent we chose to take on a project that was along the lines of an alternative A. And so I would oppose alternative A. I think it's too broad. I would also oppose alternative B because I think it's still broader than I think the problem that's in front of us. But having said that, I would be more interested in a project that would be along the lines of alternative C, but perhaps would include some of the attributes that were highlighted in the memo, I think, under your staff recommendation. And so, for example, you used in the memo, you talked about volatility, collateral, and redemption as being some attributes that we should consider. And so I would be interested in a project where we provide an example. And I was thinking along the lines of paragraph 120 in the memo where we say, we sort of describe those attributes and how they help to determine whether it's a cash equivalent. And I think in your example in the memo, you talk about, it says the issuer maintains a reserve asset in cash and cash equivalents on at least a 1-to-1 basis and is obligated to redeem for cash. And the holder has an enforceable contractual right to cash on demand from the issuer, may be also considered to be cash equivalents. So I would kind of try to use those attributes to describe what this example would be, and then maybe use examples, like fact patterns on each end of the spectrum. I think that the one thing that maybe it's not clear to me in the memo, you talk about different attributes. So like I said, volatility, collateral, redemption. It's unclear to me if you have collateral in redemption, why you might need the volatility. Because I think if you have a 1-to-1 to cash and it's, you've got an enforceable right to redemption. So that would be something that would like some further research on. I think the other thing that I was sort of interested in as well is you had 2 users that participated in your outreach. And those users highlighted their concern around certain risks, and also indicated that they would like some incremental transparency, but didn't really get a whole lot of suggestions. It struck me as it might be useful to have some kind of a dialogue, maybe with IAC or other user groups to understand, whether there's some disclosures or maybe presentation solutions that we could put in place that would help provide them the information they want. And then I'm kind of going on because I don't know exactly where everybody else is going to be in case they go down an alternative A or an alternative B. And maybe some of the other things that I'm interested in is just thinking about this, the DPEG events. And, in the memo, you talked a little bit about examples of DPEG events over time. How would that change the classification? So, for example, if you had this DPEG event, and would that certainly cause you to have a reclassification event? Would it ever come back? What would, how would, so a little more research on that. I've talked to you offline about some transition and questions and things like that, so I won't bring those up here.
Okay. Thanks, Sue. Joyce?
Thanks, Rich. Okay, so I support adding a project to the technical agenda regarding the identifiable and sufficiently pervasive need to improve gap. Clearly, your research indicates that there's diversity in practice. You found some entities where they interpreted stable coins as cash equivalents, and their practitioners supported that position, while there are other companies who are not. I think that the diversity in practice obviously plays out in the outcomes that investors will rely on. And investors are looking at liquidity risks to make decisions about the health of an organization. Those coins may be reported as cash equivalents, given the diversity. They may be financial instruments. They may be intangible assets. So I think that there is certainly a need. Obviously, we've heard and have been charged with looking at this by the President's Working Group on Digital Assets. I think that's an important request. And we may find that perhaps this issue is more pervasive across various entities. Certainly, investors have told us, and albeit we haven't spoken to many, but those who we've spoken with said that they do see this as plausible, that is, to consider the stable coins as cash equivalents, but they say that in regards to having a regulated market. And I think that's an important qualifier that they've mentioned. In addition, looking at the technical feasible solutions and the cost benefits, you've done your analysis to indicate that there should not be significant costs imposed to preparers in this regard. And again, from a benefits perspective, you've gotten some investor feedback. I do think in subsequent research that I would like to obtain broader investor feedback of the potential impact of the project. Regarding the identifiable scope, I think the staff has performed a really good analysis as indicated in Appendix F of the board memo in evaluating feedback that could have resulted in a broader scoped project, such as redefining cash, or revisiting the definition of financial assets, or addressing issuer accounting. Clearly, you've done your homework in terms of narrowing the scope appropriately, and I think that was quite prudent. So the current scoping challenge, as we have that we're facing today, is whether we have a targeted focus regarding the stable coins and other similar assets, or having a broader general focus. Before I opine on my view on this, I will just make a general observation. And I would say that in today's complex environment, where digital assets and their use are evolving rapidly, we should consider any implications of potentially codifying standards ahead of the effective date of the regulations. I think that we should be taking into consideration any requirements that are put forth as it relates to the stable coins, and ensure that we have an opportunity to assess the potential consequences of standard setting in relation to regulatory requirements. Because in my view, regulatory restrictions and definitions that go into effect potentially could be meaningful to this project prior to codifying specific aspects of stable coins and potentially other similar assets. So regarding question 2, I can actually support further research and analysis for both alternatives A and C. I think that the broader approach of alternative A focuses on the underlying rights and obligations of digital assets, and not necessarily the form of digital assets. And I think clearly, as opposed to alternative B, that this is an approach that creates an opportunity to set a standard that addresses potentially assets that may eventually evolve in the digital asset ecosystem that we perhaps may not even be privy to understanding today. I, however, think that more research is necessary to learn more about this alternative's effect on those other existing assets. Earlier in the conversation, you did answer Christine and Marsha's questions around what those potentially may be. I think that there could be unknown unintentional consequences if we do go down the alternative A path. Therefore, I believe that broader stakeholder feedback accompanied by research is needed if in fact we go down the alternative A, which I am not saying that we should not. In addition, I think that the potential of misclassifying and misrepresenting what could ultimately be very volatile instruments without identifying the characteristics to determine whether or not those stable coins or other similar assets are cash equivalents is an important potential. Therefore, I agree with the research that you've started in terms of identifying the descriptive characteristics. I think that there is value in looking specifically at the collateral criteria related to the amount and the composition of reserve asset backing and redemption rights and obligations. I think this is a plausible approach. I agree with Sue's point that, let's determine whether or not the characteristic associated with stability and value is incremental given the current definition that we have in cash equivalents. So I think, once again, let's just be considerate of regulatory requirements that go into effect. More specifically regarding alternative C, I think that we should perform a side-by-side comparison of alternative C and alternative A to determine whether there are any potential application gaps in the illustrative approach and identify where potential changes to the current definition of cash equivalents would not be necessary. So let's do that side by side to see if in fact there are holes. But with either alternative, I do support, again, having descriptive characteristics incorporated in the approach. And one point that I'll make, although we're not discussing potential disclosures today, the board memo indicated that investors who we spoke with did not mention disclosure needs in their early feedback. It would seem to me that investors would be interested in information about stable coin issuers that the holder has transacted with. The stablecoin issuer potentially presents risks to the system. For example, there potentially would be an investor who's doing an analysis to assess an issuer's ability to meet its redemption obligation to its customers. And that issuer could potentially be facing stressed times, stressed markets. The situation under a stable market may be quite different if, in fact, macroeconomic circumstances precluded them from fulfilling their redemption rights and obligations. So I think it's a form of counterparty risk. And I think that would be of interest to investors. So such disclosure, I think, would be something we should discuss with the investor community, as well as, of course, disclosures around the cash equivalent amount, which I know that you've already had some suggestions on.
Okay, thanks, Joyce. Marcia.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing this to us. I appreciate the analysis that the staff has done. I will admit that I need to catch up with the staff in thinking through all the issues that the staff has already considered. So I do know that we may be able to move somewhat quickly because the staff has done a lot of research already on some of these topics. I am comfortable adding a project to the board agenda at this time. As we think about this, I think of this as a geography project. We have our standard today on cryptocurrency digital assets. And to me, this is just the geography of where is that presented on the balance sheet. When it comes to the agenda criteria, I know that there were some views that maybe this is not a pervasive problem, or issue, but I do think that for those entities that are affected by and are following the standard that we've already issued, I think it's pervasive to them. So while that may be a subset of entities that are applying digital asset guidance, I do think that this would be very helpful. I also believe that the fact that the SEC is receiving consultations, questions about this to me is an example where standard setting can reduce costs in the system-wide approach to preparing financial statements. So I think all of those merit spending the time with this issue. Now, I did ask the follow-up question to Christine. The one question that we're not being asked to answer is, should other similar assets be limited to digital assets or not? So as I look at the alternatives that are presented to us, alternative A, alternative B, and alternative C. Alternative B is the one choice that would limit the scope to strictly digital assets as it's presented. Alternative C looks, again, like with an example, it's the opportunity to limit the scope. Where I am right now, trying to answer a question that we weren't asked, and again, I need some help or more education, is I can understand the need to provide clarity on the digital assets. I need more time to understand what are the other assets that could be affected by modifications to cash equivalents and the definitions, and why would that be beneficial? So I'm comfortable with the project, but I'm guessing that the next time we revisit this, we'll clarify a little bit more about what the similar assets could be, because I'm sure that we have a lot of people that are interested in this. I mean, my overall priorities initially would be not to minimize the unintended consequences and not to dramatically change what we are used to with cash equivalents. So that tended of your choices, A, B, C, I wanted to look at alternative C because it seemed like that would be the least change to the implementation of what's out there today. However, I might suggest an alternative C prime, not just an example, because to me, the risk with an example is almost the same thing as the risk with alternative B, that we may not be able to adequately consider all of the attributes, all of the substance over form considerations with an example or two. So I might suggest alternative C that I'd like to explore would be, what example could we provide and how can we supplement that with additional disclosures when digital assets are included in the cash equivalents? And that might give us the opportunity within the codification when we're talking about when certain disclosures would be required to address general terms such as attributes that may help us structure a standard that could live and survive as these types of assets continue to evolve in the future. So I tend to want to start understanding alternative C to see if that can address our objectives. And then the choice between alternative A and alternative B come back to me on the scope of the other similar assets, because that seems to be the fundamental difference between those two. And I'd like more time and help from the staff in understanding those differences. But I'm very supportive of having a project at this time.
Great. Thanks, Marcia. Fred?
Thanks, Rich. I think stepping back, I think it's important to recognize that kind of the discussion around stablecoins and being cash equivalents is a broad question. I mean, there's a view out there that's been expressed by many that, you know, this has the opportunity to improve real-time payments using stablecoins, and it has the opportunity to greatly improve trade finance in terms of the speed and the cost. But it also has significant risks too in this area. We know the risks are significant. This is, I think, is relative to Rich's earlier comment. This isn't fiat currency. This is private money that we're talking about, and private money has a long history, you know, throughout economies over time. And it presents, you know, unregulated private money presents significant risk to the system that I think we need to understand and be sure that we do that. Obviously, there's some issues for it, both for illicit and legal reasons. So in terms of pervasiveness, I mean, I don't think we're talking about a project narrowly for the crypto industry here, which is what currently is occurring. I don't think what we're talking about is a broader project about cash equivalents broadly. And I think that in terms of pervasiveness, I think broadly, this isn't pervasive today. It's, from my understanding, is there's a pervasive use within the crypto industry, but it's not yet moving beyond that. So in terms of that issue, I think it's interesting because I think there is anticipatory pervasiveness. We've heard that there's an anticipation of it. And I'm not opposed to something on an anticipatory basis if we view it expanding. But then it also kind of goes into the area that there's speculative pervasiveness. And are we just looking at something that people think might happen? And in some cases, that's a little bit where we're at. When we look at some of the banks who are involved in this, they look like they're just kind of putting their toe in the water to see if it might work. So, you know, in my own view, I'm kind of in between on this in terms of pervasiveness, adding it to the agenda, because it's somewhere today, I think we're between anticipatory pervasiveness, which I'd be fine with, and speculative pervasiveness. But I'm willing to defer to the President's Working Group and Congress with the Genius Act that we should go ahead and move forward on this in anticipation of greater use. The other issue that I have, I think, especially relative to investors on this, is that I think today investors, when they see cash and cash equivalents, they think of fiat currency. That's what is in their mind. And this is, as I mentioned, private money. It's not fiat currency. And it is unregulated to date. So I think the real question in my mind is, do we, and we know when the Genius Act is implemented, that there will be guardrails and safeguards to ensure that stablecoins essentially act like fiat currencies. So my one question about this project is, do we want to get accounting in front of the regulation on that? Or should we essentially put this on our agenda, which I support, as I mentioned earlier, but essentially be cognizant of the regulatory framework that's being developed, and to ensure that investors, when they see cash and cash equivalents, that they, you know, essentially are getting something that they believe is essentially a fiat currency. So I think that's important to think through as we move through this project in terms of, and be very watching what is going on with the regulations, because while the bill is passed, we don't have a regulatory framework yet. We don't have formal guardrails in place. In terms of the alternatives, I'm actually interested in B, digital currency equivalent. I think that, in my view, this is kind of, as I said, private money, digital currencies. Essentially, what isn't fiat currency and cash equivalents in a separate line as a cash equivalent? I think that would be the most transparent to investors. And so I am interested in that. I'm also interested in C, again, an example, but again, I think it's important to recognize that cash and cash equivalents should be a very high bar in terms of what goes into that. I think that's what investors view it as, even though there are some issues in cash and cash equivalents today that aren't completely clear to investors. I think when they see that line, they think in terms of fiat currency. And so I think those examples need to create a very high bar, especially if we want to move forward before we have the regulation in place. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Christine?
Good morning, team. So I would not add this to the technical agenda at this time. Instead, I do think it's important that it's on our research agenda. I think it's important that we continue to monitor developments in this space, but in my view, we just don't have enough evidence of pervasiveness to elevate it to the technical agenda. So let me explain, what my thinking is there. So first of all, I looked at the agenda consultation feedback, and this issue was not among the most frequently identified priority issue of any stakeholder type. Indeed, most respondents identified it as a low priority relative to a high priority. So we had more that said it was a low priority than we had that said it was a high priority for us to look at. I also don't believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any investors identified this as a priority issue. And in our attempts to connect with investors, we only found two, I think, that were interested in talking with us at this time, which is also consistent with it not being a hot button issue for investors. When we look at the market for stablecoins currently, it's dominated by two stablecoins that account for more than 80% of the market. And it's not clear that under their current structures, both would meet the definition of cash equivalents today or what we might do in terms of changing that definition. So we would be addressing a very limited market. And while it's true that the use of stablecoins as a substitute for cash in legitimate business transactions is growing, it still only accounts for, the best data I saw was 6% of stablecoin transactions. To Fred's point, the vast majority, I think it's 90% of stablecoin transactions are for crypto trading. So it's still very within its own economy. It's also true that stablecoins account for a very, very, very tiny fraction of just a small fraction of 1% of global US dollar payment volume today, essentially 0%. So it's just not the case that stablecoins as a cash equivalent is currently in pervasive use. I also, I think, consistent with Fred and Joy's expression, I'm a little bit concerned that we're getting out in front of regulatory developments. I believe that the Genius Act is not going to be effective until 2027. And it includes certain restrictions and definitions that are directly related to the GAAP definition of cash equivalents as applied to stablecoins. In particular, there is, I believe, a statement in that act that unless a stablecoin is issued by a permitted payment stablecoin issuer, it may not be treated as a cash equivalent for GAAP. So I think we also need to be cognizant of that and think about how that should be incorporated into the guidance that we issue. So I'm pretty concerned that if we get out in front of these regulatory changes, we may make changes today to GAAP that we have to undo tomorrow, and that can be very painful for everybody in the system. Another reason why I don't think it's pervasive issue currently is it's true that this is something new, and when something new happens and the system is trying to figure out how to account for it, there can be some churn and there might be some diversity in practice in how the existing definition of a cash equivalent is being applied in this space, but we need to let the system have some time to figure it out. And it seems that they are figuring it out. The only two examples I think that I saw in the memo was one where the SEC OCA staff looked at the facts and circumstances and concluded that in the case that was before them, that the stablecoin did meet the definition of cash equivalent. And the staff also shared that two auditing firms have accepted cash equivalent presentation when there was a reasonable case to do so. But I didn't really see a lot of actual evidence in the memo of diversity in practice. Instead, there were statements like, it's conceivable that there's currently diversity in practice, and there could be diversity in practice. So there wasn't a lot of evidence of diversity in practice. So it does seem that the system is able to use the current definition of a cash equivalent and get to a reasonable conclusion. And I think we should just allow time for the system to continue to do its work. If it ends up being that, there are clearly cases where things should be cash equivalents that are being denied that treatment, then at that point, I think we have a problem and the board should step in. So for those reasons, I would leave this project on the research agenda. I'm also concerned that while we think that this may be a quick project, I think we've learned over time, there is no such thing as a quick project. And there are other potentially more pressing issues related to crypto assets, such as crypto lending and derecognition. And I think we would be better served to have our staff resources focused on those more pressing issues. So since I would not add a project in answering the next question, I think if it's clear that we are going to add a project, we should take a very light touch. And that would put me into alternative C to try to have the least disruption possible.
Thanks, Christine. Hillary?
I want to say thanks to the staff and thanks to everyone that you did outreach with, which I think provided a lot of great context for the board for the discussion today. And based on the analysis that was put together, I do believe that this project meets the agenda criteria and therefore should be added to the technical agenda. I can appreciate the discussion related to pervasiveness today and whether it's pervasive today, whether it will be pervasive in the future. I do think that this is an emerging type of transaction, and I am comfortable adding it to the technical agenda, looking at the criteria of the fact that it may be pervasive in the future. Certainly, I do think that when I think about pervasiveness, that may impact the way that I think about which alternatives I'm most interested in, which I can kind of walk through a little bit more detail. But when thinking about adding this to the agenda, I think one of the things that at least I think about is not necessarily wanting to take a very broad approach to this project. I am absolutely sensitive to feedback that Christine provided with regards to whether or not this can be done on a timely basis. I don't think that the definition of cash equivalents that exists in GAAP today is broken. I do think that there are folks out there that are applying the guidance today, and I do think that you can apply the existing guidance to stablecoins and come to a reasoned conclusion. Now, I think what we can do is help provide parameters around that to ensure there's not diversity in practice. So certainly, I'm interested in looking at this project more narrowly in trying to provide feedback and guidance for all of our stakeholders going through our thorough due process to be able to identify in what situations a stablecoin meets the definition of a cash equivalent using our existing definition or not. So you can probably guess I am not looking for an alternative B solution here, not looking to provide a new definition of a digital cash equivalent. Instead, I'm much more in a view or alternative C camp with regards to examples. I think examples could be quite helpful here with regards to if we think the existing definition isn't broken and we think it can be applied, we're really just providing clarity of how to look at certain types of stable coins and whether they would be in or out of the scope. I think that then helps us with not necessarily getting into a lot of other questions with regards to scope. We can just define the types of instruments and the features that we're seeing and the characteristics of those and provide some feedback with regards to whether we think those would or would not meet the existing definition of a cash equivalent. So certainly I think that that's an important process that we provide to our stakeholders, right, is being able to make sure the codification continues to be relevant and up to date, especially for emerging types of transactions. I think then when we think about the different examples, I certainly agree with some of the feedback that was provided earlier with at least with regards to goalposts, right? Stablecoin that has certain, what are the attributes we think would make it a cash equivalent and which attributes would we think would not make it a cash equivalent. And I do think the staff identified, characteristics related to redemption and collateral that I think are really important. And when I think of this, I do focus on keeping it more narrow, right? Redemption, I think of that as you have a direct redemption right from the issuer to be able to get cash, right, or a cash equivalent. I'm not interested in having that be broader to you can liquidate in a secondary market, right? Again, just really trying to stay true to the guidance that we have from a cash equivalent perspective. And I do think collateral is really important to be able to focus on to ensure that you have, fully backed qualifying assets, right, as collateral. So I think that those are things we can present through examples. I think we can do that in an efficient manner, and I'd be really interested in us exploring that. If we determine as a board that we don't think examples are the best way to move forward, then I'm probably more interested in alternative A in trying to make sure that we can provide that clarity through, I still think of that as an example, right, but in a different way. So certainly that would be an something that I would like to further think about. I do think with regards to the Genius Act, I think it's important to recognize that no matter what guidance we put in place, there is still a need for entities to have to look at their accounting in the world of, the application of laws and regulations as well, right? We can only control what's in GAAP. We can't control what's done from a regulation perspective. So I think there could be an instance where we determine that something would meet the definition of a cash equivalent that perhaps current or future regulatory environment could say is not a cash equivalent. I'm comfortable with what we're able to do within GAAP and provide whether or not that would be a cash equivalent from a GAAP perspective. So I think that's what we should be focused on from this project is what we are able to control, which is looking at the existing GAAP guidance and whether or not certain stablecoins would meet that guidance. I think that's about it for now.
Thanks, Hillary. So avoidance of doubt, yes, I'm supportive of adding a project to our agenda. I actually think the objective should be to deal with a subset of digital assets and their classification as cash equivalents or not. And maybe a little more specificity on that. I view alternative A and B as actually changing the definition of cash equivalents, and C is really illustrating the application to a new type of instrument. So I'm more supportive of the alternative C approach. Similar to Hillary, I think the definition generally works. I think where we run into problems is that people don't read the entire definition sometimes. The key part for me is that it has to meet both characteristics to be a cash equivalent. And inherent in there is the concept of maturity. And I do believe redeemable can be equated to maturity. But maturity means you can actually get cash. And I think that's a key focus for me. And I think there's a difference between a redemption right and something being collateralized where I'm not sure you really have the right to those assets. And I think it's got to be clear you have a financial asset with the right to effectively cash. I think examples would be a good way to go. And I think the key about an example is an example that might work and an example that doesn't work. Because the sense I've gotten is there's uncertainty in the application of GAAP today, and that people are very concerned, even in those where we might look at it and say, we think the answer is pretty clear, that they're going to be second guessed because it's in this new category. And I think that's where, as a standard setter, we have a role to help bring clarity. A couple of things that I think would be important in an example, I think making the point that redeemable is akin to maturity is key. And that maturity concept and that ability to get cash is a key part of it. I think understanding what is backing redemption and how stable the value is and how really liquid is key. I think the concept, if I go back to money market funds, when they broke the buck, they weren't cash equivalents anymore. Going back to Sue's point about depegging, I think there's got to be a concept that you have a stable claim to value and through that redemption right. And I think that will introduce certain complexity for people who are investing in these things and understanding the stability of that value to treat it as a cash equivalent. A couple other things reinforcing that cash equivalence is an accounting policy election. We don't force people to put everything that meets the definition of a cash equivalent into cash equivalents. We allow them to make an accounting policy election. And I think that's actually pretty helpful when it comes to interaction, for example, with the Genius Act. There is, Christine read the statement, and it's pretty clear that under the law, classifying certain things as cash equivalents for accounting purposes would be in violation of the law. I can't imagine anyone would elect an accounting policy that that violated the law. So I think we actually can talk about the application of our standard and just remind people when you're making your accounting policy election, make sure that you're considering local law. And there may be others who will be in a better position to answer how that law works and exactly what does qualify and not qualify under US GAAP or even IFRS under that law. In just a couple of things, we talked a little about disclosure. And it is interesting. You have to disclose your accounting policy for cash equivalents, which is effectively what you've included and what you haven't. If we do hear that there's concerns about different categories of items in the cash equivalents accounting policy election, and people are looking for insight into that, I understand that, and maybe that's where they're looking for more detail on how much is U.S. Treasuries that are within 3 months of maturity, how much is in money market funds, how much is in a digital asset. I would understand that, but I would think that that would be something that if we were going to pursue, we'd pursue for the breakout of overall cash equivalents. So obviously, I'm more interested in the application of the current definition and giving examples, giving clarity in the application of GAAP, and also being clear that there's some examples out there that people call stablecoins that definitely do not meet the definition of a cash equivalent. I think that's just as helpful as what does. But I also heard from the majority of my board, they're interested in exploring alternative A and B. So, I'll certainly be educated on those points as we go along. So with that, I think our staff probably has enough. I do want to thank the staff. It was a robust analysis. I know a lot of people spent a lot of time with our staff to give us the details to understand some newer transactions. So I appreciate it. And I look forward to welcoming this staff back at a future meeting. Great. So with that, I believe that wraps up today's meeting. Thanks, everyone.